Imagine a fortress so powerful that it has watched over a kingdom for almost 1,000 years. A place where kings ruled, prisoners were held, wars were planned, and secrets were buried beneath stone walls. From a distance, it looks timeless. Towers rising above the countryside, massive walls standing firm against centuries of history. But what if I told you this castle was never meant to be beautiful? It was meant to control a nation. Hidden behind its royal ceremonies and magnificent halls lies a far more complicated story. A story about conquest, ambition, loyalty, and power. This is Windsor Castle, the largest inhabited castle on Earth. Home to 39 monarchs, countless servants, and more political drama than almost any palace in Europe. But the real question isn't how this castle survived for 1,000 years. The real question is what it cost to build it, and what it reveals about the power that shaped Britain. Let's go back to the beginning, to a moment that completely changed England forever. In the year 1066, a man from across the English Channel changed the course of British history. His name was William, Duke of Normandy. When his army defeated King Harold at the famous Battle of Hastings, William didn't just win a crown. He took control of an entire country. But conquering a land is one thing. Holding it is something else entirely. William understood something very quickly. If he wanted to keep England under his rule, he needed control points across the kingdom. Fortresses, strongholds, places where soldiers could defend territory and send reinforcements quickly if rebellion broke out. So he began building a network of castles surrounding London, each one positioned strategically, each one powerful enough to suppress any uprising. And among those castles, one location stood out: a chalk hill rising above the River Thames. From that hill, you could control the western approach to London. You could see enemies coming from miles away, and nearby stretched a massive royal hunting forest. To William, it was the perfect location. There was only one small detail. The land didn't belong to him. It belonged to a Saxon estate. But William didn't negotiate. He took it. And on that hill, around the year 1070, the first version of Windsor Castle was born. The earliest Windsor Castle looked nothing like the grand stone palace we see today. There were no elegant towers, no royal apartments, no grand halls. Instead, it was something far more primitive and far more brutal. Workers dug a massive ditch around the hill. The earth they removed was piled into a towering mound nearly 50 feet high. At the top of that mound, they built a wooden defensive wall. Around the base of the hill, two enclosed areas were created, one above and one below. This basic layout would define the castle's structure for the next 1,000 years. But the men who built it were not Norman soldiers. They were Saxon laborers, men whose country had just been conquered. They carried soil in baskets. They cut timber. They raised walls for a king whose language they could barely understand. History does not remember their names. Records rarely mention them. Yet their labor created one of the most powerful fortresses in Europe. And when the work was finished, they disappeared into the silence of history. Interestingly, William the Conqueror himself never actually lived at Windsor. For him, the castle was simply a military base, a symbol of control, a warning to anyone who might challenge his rule. But his youngest son saw something different. Around the year 1110, King Henry I moved into Windsor Castle, and that decision changed everything. For the first time, the fortress became a royal residence. In 1121, Henry even held his wedding inside its walls. Suddenly, the castle needed more than soldiers and defenses. It needed living quarters, comfort, space for court life. And once a king begins living somewhere, the transformation begins. During the reign of Henry II in the 12th century, Windsor began its first major transformation. The wooden defenses were gradually replaced with stone walls. A powerful structure called the Round Tower was constructed on top of the original mound. Even today, that tower dominates the castle's skyline. Massive stone walls were built around key sections of the fortress. Some were nearly 7 meters thick. Henry also introduced a layout that would shape Windsor for centuries. Separate royal spaces, public areas where official business was conducted, and private apartments where the monarch could live away from the eyes of the court. The division between public power and private life was literally built into the architecture, stone by stone. But Windsor's new strength would soon face its first real test. In 1216, during a rebellion known as the First Barons' War, enemy forces surrounded the castle. For 2 months, they attempted to capture it. Across southeast England, many royal strongholds fell. But Windsor did not. The fortress held. It always seemed to hold. And that ability to endure would define Windsor Castle's story for centuries to come. By the 14th century, Windsor Castle was no longer just a defensive fortress. It was becoming something far more powerful, a symbol of royal identity. And the king responsible for that transformation was Edward III. Edward was born inside Windsor Castle in 1312, and throughout his life he maintained a deep personal connection to the place. But Edward was not only a king. He was a man obsessed with chivalry, honor, and the idea of knighthood. In medieval Europe, knights were more than soldiers. They represented loyalty, courage, and the military strength of the crown. Edward believed England needed a powerful order of knights that would unite the most influential warriors of the kingdom under the king's authority. So, in 1348, he created something that still exists today, the Order of the Garter. It became the most prestigious order of chivalry in England. Membership was extremely limited. Only the king, the Prince of Wales, and 24 chosen knights could belong to the order. But this was not just a ceremonial club. It was a political strategy. By tying the most powerful nobles directly to the crown through honor and ritual, Edward strengthened his control over the kingdom. And Windsor Castle became the center of this new system. Every ceremony, every gathering, every grand celebration of the Order of the Garter would take place within the castle walls. Windsor was no longer just a fortress. It had become the spiritual home of English knighthood. To match his grand vision, Edward III began one of the largest construction projects in medieval England. The castle would be almost completely rebuilt. The work lasted for more than 20 years. Massive new buildings appeared across the upper ward of the castle. Luxurious royal apartments were constructed for the king and his queen, Philippa of Hainault. Courtyards were redesigned. Gatehouses were strengthened. And one of the most important rooms in the castle was created, St. George's Hall. This enormous chamber was designed to host the ceremonies of the Order of the Garter. The banners of the knights would hang above the seats, representing the most powerful men in the realm. Visitors entering the hall would instantly understand the message. This was not just a residence. This was the center of royal power. The scale of Edward's project was enormous. Thousands of workers were involved. Stone was transported from quarries across the region. Carpenters, masons, and craftsmen worked year-round, often in difficult conditions. Historical records show the project consumed vast amounts of money. But just like the earliest builders of Windsor, many of the laborers remained invisible to history. Their names were rarely recorded. Their lives were rarely mentioned. Yet their work shaped one of the greatest castles in Europe. Interestingly, Windsor Castle also attracted some remarkable figures. One of them was Geoffrey Chaucer. Today he is famous as the author of The Canterbury Tales, one of the most important works in English literature. But for a time, Chaucer also worked as a royal official responsible for overseeing construction and finances at Windsor. This meant the same man who wrote stories about medieval life was also involved in managing the works of one of the most important castles in England. Windsor had become a place where politics, culture, and architecture all intersected. And the castle continued evolving. In 1475, another major project began under King Edward IV. He ordered the construction of a magnificent new church inside the castle grounds. This would become St. George's Chapel. The project took more than 50 years to complete. When finished, it became one of the finest examples of perpendicular Gothic architecture in England. Its high stone ceilings seemed to float above the interior. Stained glass windows filled the chapel with color. Carved wooden stalls lined the choir, each representing a knight of the Order of the Garter. Above them hung the banners of those knights, turning the chapel into a living symbol of English chivalry. Over time, the chapel would also become the final resting place of many British monarchs. Kings and queens were buried beneath its floors. Even today, the chapel remains one of the most important royal churches in Britain. When the Tudor dynasty came to power in the late 15th century, Windsor Castle continued to play an important role. One of the most famous Tudor monarchs, Henry VIII, made several changes to the castle. He strengthened key gates and added new facilities within the grounds. Henry also loved entertainment and sport. At Windsor, he ordered the construction of a tennis court, a popular royal pastime at the time. But Windsor also served a strategic purpose. During periods of rebellion and political unrest, Henry often used the castle as a secure refuge. Behind its massive walls, he could direct military responses and maintain control of the kingdom. Later, Queen Elizabeth I also spent time restoring parts of the castle. By the late 1500s, some areas had fallen into disrepair, and Elizabeth ordered renovations and improvements. One of her most notable additions was a long gallery overlooking the North Terrace, which would later become part of the Royal Library. Under the Tudors, Windsor remained what it had always been, a mixture of palace, fortress, and political symbol. But the 17th century would bring a crisis unlike anything the castle had seen before. For the first time in its long history, Windsor Castle would become something completely unexpected. Not a palace, not a fortress, but a prison for a king. And the events that followed would change British history forever. By the early 1600s, Windsor Castle had already survived more than 5 centuries of political change. Kings had lived there. Knights had gathered there. Royal ceremonies had taken place within its halls. But nothing in its long history prepared the castle for what happened during the English Civil War. In 1642, England was divided. On one side stood King Charles I, who believed strongly in the absolute authority of the monarchy. On the other side stood Parliament, supported by powerful political leaders and military commanders who wanted to limit the king's power. The conflict quickly spread across the country. Cities chose sides. Armies marched. And castles became critical military positions. That same year, parliamentary forces captured Windsor Castle. For the first time since its creation nearly 600 years earlier, the fortress was no longer under royal control. Instead of housing a king, Windsor became a military headquarters for Parliament's army. Barracks were set up inside the castle. Captured royalist officers were imprisoned within its walls. Even the treasures of St. George's Chapel were stripped away. The sacred banners and symbols of the Order of the Garter were removed. The castle that had once celebrated royal authority was now being used to fight against it. And then came the moment that would permanently mark Windsor's history. In 1649, the Civil War reached its dramatic conclusion. King Charles I had been captured. He was placed on trial by Parliament, something almost unimaginable at the time. For centuries, English monarchs had ruled by what they believed was divine right. The idea that a king could be judged by his own people shocked Europe. But the trial went forward. Charles was found guilty of treason, and he was sentenced to death. On January 30th, 1649, in front of a crowd in London, Charles I was executed. The king wore 2 shirts that day because of the winter cold. He reportedly feared that if he shivered, people might mistake it for fear. After the execution, his body was placed in a coffin and transported back to Windsor. A heavy snowstorm covered the countryside as the funeral procession approached the castle. Without grand ceremony, the fallen king was buried inside St. George's Chapel, beside the tombs of earlier monarchs. No royal prayers, no elaborate ritual, only silence. Windsor Castle had witnessed the rise of kings. Now it had witnessed the death of one. For the next decade, England was ruled not by a king, but by a government led by Oliver Cromwell. During this time, Windsor Castle remained under military control. But in 1660, the monarchy was restored. Charles I's son returned from exile and became King Charles II. And with his return came a dramatic transformation of Windsor. Charles II wanted the castle to represent the rebirth of royal power. He hired architect Hugh May to redesign many of the interiors. The goal was simple: create rooms that could rival the luxury of the great palaces of Europe. Artists painted elaborate ceilings. Woodcarvers crafted detailed decorative panels. Grand state apartments were created where the king could entertain ambassadors and foreign guests. These rooms were not just beautiful, they were political theater. Every painting, every piece of furniture, every golden decoration reminded visitors that the monarchy had returned stronger than before. Charles II also created one of Windsor's most famous features, the Long Walk. This enormous avenue stretches nearly 3 miles from the castle into Windsor Great Park. Over 1,600 elm trees were planted in perfect alignment along the path. Even today, the Long Walk remains one of the most spectacular royal landscapes in Europe. Yet after Charles II's death, Windsor slowly lost importance. Several later monarchs preferred other royal residences. Some spent more time at Hampton Court Palace. Others favored smaller private homes. For almost a century, Windsor Castle was rarely used as a primary royal residence. The magnificent state apartments built by Charles II gathered dust. Large sections of the castle remained empty. But that would change again in the late 18th century. When King George III came to the throne in 1760, he decided to make Windsor a royal home once again. George III had a large family, 15 children in total, and needed space for court life. He also saw Windsor as a place where the royal family could live more privately, away from the crowded political world of London. Large renovations were carried out. Collections of paintings and artworks were moved to the castle. New improvements were made throughout the estate. Windsor slowly returned to life. But George III's reign also carried tragedy. Later in life, the king suffered severe mental illness. His condition eventually forced him into isolation. And in a strange twist of history, the castle that once held a captured king now became the place where another king lived in confinement during his final years. It was George III's son, George IV, who transformed Windsor into the spectacular castle we recognize today. George had an obsession with architecture and luxury. When he became king in 1820, he launched one of the most ambitious rebuilding projects in the castle's history. Architect Geoffrey Wyatville was hired to redesign large parts of Windsor. The round tower was raised higher to create the dramatic skyline we see today. New battlements and towers were added to give the castle a powerful Gothic appearance. Inside, massive halls were redesigned. One of the most impressive spaces created during this time was the Waterloo Chamber, built to celebrate the defeat of Napoleon. Portraits of the Allied military leaders were placed along its walls. The room became a symbol of Britain's victory and global influence. But these renovations were extremely expensive. The final cost eventually exceeded £1 million, an enormous sum at the time. Yet despite all the spending, George IV barely had time to enjoy his masterpiece. He died in 1830, only a short time after moving into the newly transformed castle. Once again, Windsor had outlived the king who reshaped it. When Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837, Windsor Castle entered a completely new chapter. At first, Victoria didn't even like the castle. She once described it as dull and uncomfortable. The massive stone walls and endless corridors felt cold and isolating. But everything changed after she married Prince Albert. Albert loved architecture, design, and improvement projects. He threw himself into transforming Windsor. Gardens were redesigned. Towers were repaired. New pathways were built connecting the castle to the nearby town. Under Albert's influence, Windsor slowly became a lively royal residence filled with family life. Victoria and Albert had 9 children, and the castle was suddenly full of energy. Christmas traditions were introduced here that would eventually spread across Britain and the world. Decorated Christmas trees, a German custom brought by Albert, became part of royal celebrations. For 2 decades, Windsor Castle was not just a palace. It was a family home. But in 1861, tragedy struck. Prince Albert died suddenly at the age of just 42. His death devastated Queen Victoria. She ordered Albert's rooms at Windsor to be preserved exactly as they had been on the day he died. His clothes were laid out each evening. Fresh water was placed beside his washing basin every morning. Victoria withdrew from public life and spent long periods at Windsor, surrounded by memories of the man she loved. The castle became something very different. Not just a residence, but a monument to grief. As the 20th century approached, Windsor Castle continued to serve as a center of royal life. But history soon forced the monarchy to make a dramatic decision. During World War I, Britain found itself fighting Germany. At the time, the British royal family actually carried a German name. The dynasty was called Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, inherited from Prince Albert's family. In the middle of a war against Germany, this name became politically dangerous. So, in 1917, King George V made a historic decision. He changed the royal family's name. The new name was inspired by the castle that had stood for centuries as a symbol of British monarchy. From that moment forward, the royal family became known as the House of Windsor. The castle had given its name to the dynasty itself. When World War II began in 1939, Windsor Castle once again returned to its defensive role. Blackout curtains covered every window so enemy aircraft could not see the castle at night. Basements were turned into air raid shelters. Important artworks and documents were moved to safer locations. 2 young princesses were brought to Windsor for protection. Their names were Elizabeth and Margaret. Elizabeth, only 13 years old at the time, would later become Queen Elizabeth II. During the war, life at Windsor continued under strict wartime rules. Food was rationed. Gardens inside the castle grounds were used to grow vegetables. Even the royal children helped with simple wartime duties. In 1940, Princess Elizabeth made her first public speech from Windsor Castle during a BBC radio broadcast. She spoke to children who had been evacuated from their homes during the war. Her message was simple but powerful. Even in the middle of war, hope remained. Few people listening that night could imagine that the young princess speaking from the castle would one day become the longest reigning monarch in British history. For centuries, Windsor had survived wars, political revolutions, and dramatic changes in the monarchy. But one of the greatest disasters in its history happened in modern times. On November 20th, 1992, a fire broke out inside the castle. A spotlight overheated near the Queen's private chapel. Within minutes, flames spread through the roof. The fire quickly moved through several historic rooms. Massive halls were destroyed. Ceilings collapsed. Historic interiors were badly damaged. More than 200 firefighters battled the blaze. They fought the fire for 15 hours. By the time it was finally under control, over 100 rooms had been damaged or destroyed. But an extraordinary rescue effort saved many priceless objects. Soldiers, staff, and even members of the royal family helped carry paintings, furniture, and historic artifacts out of the burning building. Thousands of items were rescued. Yet a new question quickly emerged. Who would pay to repair the castle? The restoration cost was enormous. Public debate followed. Eventually, Queen Elizabeth II made a major decision. Parts of Buckingham Palace would be open to visitors for the first time, and the ticket revenue would help fund the restoration. The rebuilding of Windsor Castle took 5 years. By 1997, the restoration was complete. The castle had survived again. For nearly 1,000 years, Windsor Castle has stood above the River Thames. Kings have ruled from its halls. Knights have sworn loyalty within its chapel. Prisoners have waited behind its walls. Families have lived, loved, and mourned inside its rooms. Every generation has reshaped the castle. Every monarch has left a mark. But beneath the towers, beneath the grand halls, beneath the banners of royal ceremony, something older still remains. A mound of chalk earth, dug by unknown laborers almost 1,000 years ago, men whose names history never recorded. They built the foundation of Windsor for a conqueror who spoke a different language. And today, the castle still stands on the ground they shaped. Perhaps that is the real story of Windsor Castle. Not just a palace of kings, but a monument to power, ambition, and the countless unseen lives that built history itself. And after 1,000 years, its walls are still watching, still standing.